As we quickly approach the Federal Reserve's much-anticipated policy meeting, economic indicators aren't painting the most hopeful picture for the U.S. economy. The October employment report, always a closely watched signal of labor market health, has been struck by a perfect storm, almost literally. We've got the lingering damage caused by 2 hurricanes, one of the largest strikes of the decade, and a workforce increasingly dissatisfied with the state of the economy, capped off by a looming presidential election that has turned every data point into political fodder. And yet, many are still asking if the Federal Reserve's decision next week is going to be impacted much by this wild patch of data. Let me tell you, it's a mess. But hey, what else is new in this mismanaged economy? If you've been following us here on Boss Economics World, you'd know we like to look past the optics, which is something we'll do in this analysis. Sure, it's easy to blame Mother Nature for the slow labor recovery. After all, Hurricanes Helene and Milton wreaked havoc on people's lives across multiple states, yet, there are bigger, systemic issues that have put the U.S. economy on shaky ground for years now. And these are not being addressed quickly enough, if at all. So, fasten your seatbelts, we're about to dive deep into what's really going on beneath these employment numbers. I'll walk you through why the numbers are much worse than they appear and, even more importantly, why the economic outlook paints a grim picture for the months ahead. First, let's be clear, there's no denying the economic power of natural disasters. The devastation is real. According to early estimates from the Goldman Sachs Group, these storms have caused about $90 billion in damage. Hurricanes Helene and Milton, which made landfall in late September and early October respectively, disrupted millions of lives and crimped business operations in several states. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, in its forthcoming report, will almost certainly reflect some of these disruptions. But while these hurricanes are the headliners today, let's not be too quick to pin all our economic woes on them. If only the problem were that simple, unfortunately, it's not. The October employment report is expected to be one of the weakest since the pandemic recovery began in earnest in 2020, with a projected gain of just 110,000 jobs for the month. That's less than half the jobs added in September. The reasons for the slowdown are complicated. Analysts point to the hurricanes as the primary disruptor of growth. Businesses lay idle as storms ravaged key states like North Carolina and Florida, crucial hubs for construction, retail, and even parts of the tech sector. It's also worth digging deeper into the timing. Milton hit during the period when payrolls are usually being calculated. Many workers who missed shifts for a few days won't make it into the payroll stats, so we may see inflated joblessness figures. Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's, expects a direct cut in payroll numbers of around 100,000 jobs because of these combined events alone. Now, sure, these figures seem pretty sharp. But let's take a moment to look at the wider pattern. Sure, the hurricanes shaved off some employment gains. But storms don't explain the whole picture. Let's also point out what these short-term impacts tend to mask. The reality is that in the long run, areas hit by hurricanes often experience a recovery boost to GDP. Following Katrina, for example, New Orleans eventually saw substantial citywide rebuilding efforts that amped up construction jobs and increased retail influx. This could well happen again, with Helene and Milton's aftermath spurring a near-term revival. However, if GDP rebalances in early 2025 due to storm recovery, this won't mean systemic health. The growth, as Goldman Sachs points out, will just be a temporary inflation of the numbers. But, let's not kid ourselves. The hurricane impacts we're talking about are only papering over the deeper structural cracks caused by economists and policymakers alike. More on that in a bit. While natural disasters are a time-honored excuse for underperformance, the Boeing strike packs another punch. As of mid-October, around 44,000 workers officially went on strike, halting operations at the historically significant Boeing company. This is no small strike, it's one of the biggest standoffs we've seen in years, and it reflects a broader sentiment that runs deep in the American workforce. Let's be clear, labor unrest is back, and with a vengeance. It's more than just Boeing. In total, the U.S. saw over 735,000 workers involved in strikes in 2023, the most significant wave of labor deals since the 1980s. Employees are striking not simply for better wages but also for improved working conditions, better healthcare benefits, and job security. You can't ignore the corporate greed narrative that's dominated the Biden administration and how the Democrats have seemingly lost control over their ability to pacify their own voter base, laborers and unions. Over at Boeing, labor relations soured for the simple fact that the company has been raking in profits, while real wages stagnated for the majority of its workforce. The discontent we're seeing now is a byproduct of a broader structural mismatch in the economy. Employees across sectors, from tech to infrastructure, feel increasingly alienated and underpaid, while profit margins soar for large corporations. What we're really seeing is a crisis of income inequality, heightened by inflation, where real purchasing power declined over the past few years despite all the government's talk of economic recovery. Boeing is symbolic of that broader national rage. Despite their broader boom in defense and aerospace contracts from the government, thank you, Pentagon, executives have failed to pass these benefits onto their workforce. Then throw in the inflationary pressures on basic necessities, housing, energy, healthcare, and you have the perfect recipe for a labor strike. Boeing is both the canary in the coal mine and a microcosm of what's happening at large across America. The working class is fed up with widening inequality. Let's link this labor unrest back to the broader economy. These strikes have crippled sectors beyond industrial manufacturing. The pause in production has had ripple effects, leading to lost revenue for companies along Boeing's vast supply chains. Economists at Moody's predict that strikes in these sectors alone could prevent the labor market from bouncing back before 2024. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in lost output. Reinforcing this mess, we're seeing layoffs rising again, from 100,000 in September to widespread estimates that October will see a drastic uptick thanks to weaker consumer demand, higher borrowing costs, and, you guessed it, the layoffs triggered by Boeing's standoff. So, it's not just the hurricane, friends. This labor implosion is serious, and is yet another battering ram against the door of economic recovery in the U.S. Now we turn our attention to yet another critical component of today's economic headwinds, Federal Reserve policy. As you know, folks, the Fed has been running the show when it comes to propping up the markets with its grappling hooks of rate adjustments. And here we stand, cornered between high inflation, high interest rates, and stagnant consumer spending. The Fed, already signaling a quarter-point rate cut at the upcoming meeting on November 6 to 7, claims that it remains data-driven. Well, excuse me, but if there were ever a time when data is unreliable and volatile, it's now. The idea of pursuing a soft landing for the economy, where inflation cools and we avoid tipping into an outright recession, was perhaps one of the most dangerous promises made over the past year. For months, Fed officials, corporate shills, and government workers were quick to wave off concerns about impending recessionary pressures. Yet reality paints a different picture. Sure, inflation numbers might have come down toward the Fed's 2% target, but core inflation, excluding volatile food and energy prices, isn't budging as fast as many would like. And if consumers are struggling to afford the necessities, it's no surprise that they're pulling back on discretionary spending. Retail sales have slowed, and in a consumer-driven economy, this spells trouble for continued growth. If inflation is allegedly under control, why does nearly 61% of the U.S. population still live paycheck to paycheck? The real kicker. As economists nervously watch the headlines, there's a growing sense among many that these rate cuts are too little, too late. Lower rates may spur some borrowers to open their wallets again, but with stagnant wage growth, a labor revolt, and external global instability, oil prices and war in the Middle East causing spikes everywhere, rate cuts aren't going to be the silver bullet. Moreover, the real danger comes down to this. Household debt stood at a staggering $17 trillion in mid-2023, according to the New York Federal Reserve. Mortgage rates above 7%, ballooning credit card debt, and auto loans crisis are leaving many Americans utterly strapped. So, a cut off a quarter point or even half point on interest rates is a band-aid on a gaping wound. The deeper issue is that household debt, inequality, and systemic inflationary pressures are crushing the average American, regardless of what the rate charts tell us. When rates have been held high for too long, the cost of borrowing becomes unbearable, while wages, as I mentioned earlier, vanish into thin air once you factor in real inflation. Does a 0.25% rate cut truly offer relief to that person choosing between groceries and rent? Hardly. The traditional safety valves of monetary policy are failing to address an economic machine that has long been broken. Rate cuts make headlines and boost investor confidence, but they don't result in a living wage for the average worker. They don't freeze rent prices or stabilize energy costs. That's the real problem. The Fed, by focusing too narrowly on inflation targeting and interest rates, is missing the larger context, which is a favorite theme on this show, the structural imbalances in the economy. With just days before the presidential election, this employment report couldn't have been more politically charged. Whether the numbers come out rosier than expected or fall short, the current administration is going to face immense scrutiny from both sides of the aisle. After all, it's no secret that the jobs report will serve as ammunition for both Democrats and Republicans to push their narratives. President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris have staked much of their economic credibility on shepherding what they've persistently referred to as a successful economic recovery following the pandemic days. But we must ask ourselves, how successful has that recovery really been? Sure, unemployment is theoretically low, sitting at around 4.1%. However, we all know that unemployment figures are notoriously misleading, especially when we factor in the large number of underemployed individuals, gig workers, and those who've simply dropped out of the labor force altogether after failing to find adequate work. Meanwhile, Donald Trump and his Republican challengers have lambasted the current administration, pointing to issues like inflation and wage stagnation as key indicators that Bidenomics is an active failure. They argue that despite job numbers showing growth, real purchasing power has been eroded, leaving people worse off overall than they were during Trump's term, at least from their perspective. With inflation finally trending back toward the Fed's 2% target, there is less room for Democrats to talk economic management, especially if this report underperforms as expected. However, this employment report is not just another data point, it's become a political football, and voters are understandably struggling to figure out which numbers reflect the truth. Outside of pure politics, these numbers are critical signals that the economy's resilience is far more tenuous than either side would like to admit. Hurricanes, strikes, and labor unrest are merely exaggerating underlying economic weaknesses, and instead of addressing structural causes, both parties appear too focused on spinning the data for short-term electoral gain. This employment report is just one corner in a much larger, more complex portrait of America's economic trajectory. What we're witnessing is not simply the fallout from natural disasters or labor disruptions, but the continued unraveling of a system that has been built on the shaky foundation of debt-fueled growth, deregulation of corporate markets, and increasing wealth inequality. It's impossible to talk about the U.S. economy in 2024 without talking about the gaping chasm between America's richest citizens and everyone else. The top 1% of U.S. households own 40% of the nation's wealth, according to the latest data from the Federal Reserve. Meanwhile, working-class individuals, those you see in the striking Boeing workers or retail employees, are increasingly locked out of home ownership, reliable healthcare, and even education. So while the unemployment rate paints a picture of a strong labor market, it doesn't tell you that real wages for many have been stagnant since the 1970s. The hurricanes and Boeing strike may have cut into job growth for a month, but the lingering picture is bleak for millions of Americans whose wages don't keep up with inflation, nor match the basic cost of living in dozens of metropolitan areas across the U.S. Housing isn't just pricey in San Francisco or New York anymore. Shelter inflation has burdened markets from Salt Lake City to Austin, Texas, leaving an entire generation unable to build wealth through homeownership, traditionally one of the main vehicles for upward mobility in America. Economists and policymakers alike cannot afford to look away from the growing debt crisis faced by U.S. households. With a grand total of $17 trillion in debt, including mortgage, student loans, and especially credit card debt, many Americans are dangerously overleveraged. According to recent reports, credit card interest rates have surged to around 25%, and total consumer debt has grown by over $1.5 trillion since 2019. Ask yourself this: how on earth can working-class Americans expect to service this debt burden in a high-interest environment with stagnant wage growth? The answer is increasingly inescapable: they can't. Sure, the Fed's potential rate cuts may offer minor relief to some borrowers, but it won't solve the desperate need for households to make basic ends meet. If costs continue to rise while incomes remain stagnant, the American consumer, the engine of our economic vitality, will falter. Yes, the headline unemployment number looks relatively healthy, but the quality of jobs being created is another story. The rise of gig work, as exemplified by companies like DoorDash and Uber, has masked many of the deeper issues plaguing the labor market. These gig economy roles provide some flexibility but lack the stability, benefits, and wage protections seen in traditional full-time employment. As the employment report shows, temporary boosts in job creation, whether through part-time roles or low-wage service jobs, do not equal long-term economic stability. And with rising interest rates, borrowing becomes harder for small businesses, a crucial component of job creation in the U.S., which further undermines future employment prospects. Even as we focus on domestic issues, the world economy in 2024 provides little optimism for an easy recovery. Two primary factors undermine confidence in the global marketplace: volatility in energy markets and geopolitical instability. With major disruptions in the oil-producing regions, particularly the continuing crisis in the Middle East, global energy markets remain under considerable strain. Although the U.S. is somewhat insulated by its own domestic oil production, high energy prices inevitably trickle down to consumers. Whether through increased gas prices at the pump or rising utility bills, inflation in energy adds further stress to already tight household budgets. According to the Energy Information Administration, U.S. crude oil inventories are dwindling, and gasoline prices surged by over 15% in 2023 alone. This price squeeze disproportionately affects low-income families, who spend a larger percentage of their income on energy than high-earning households. Geopolitical tensions are another wild card that continue to loom over the market's performance. Just as supply chains have been recovering from pandemic disruptions, China's economic slowdown, combined with continued trade tensions with Western economies, poses a significant risk to global trade flow. Some estimates predict that China's GDP growth could slow to below 4% by 2025, due to both internal and external factors, such as demographic shifts and persistent export imbalances. Throw in geopolitical conflicts, like the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, and regional unrest, and you have the ingredients of a global economy that lacks the sturdy framework for growth. As we wrap up our analysis, it's critical to recognize that the U.S. economy is dancing on the knife's edge of deeper systemic issues. Yes, hurricanes and strikes are today's scapegoats, but beyond these temporary bumps, there lies a far more concerning story about debt, wage stagnation, and inequality. The fact that the job market is facing storms, both literal and metaphorical, is emblematic of a deeper crisis, a crisis that monetary policy alone cannot fix. This employment report will come and go, major headlines and talking points will fill the airwaves in the days before the presidential election, and we will be told that everything is working out just fine. But behind the numbers, behind the political theater, millions of American workers are struggling to afford a basic standard of living, and the systemic improvements that could ease that pain are nowhere in sight. If this report shows anything, it's that our economy is fragile. The hurricanes, Boeing strikes, and interest rate cuts are just layers of frosting on a very unsavory cake. The U.S. needs real interventions, ones that address the root causes of wage suppression, runaway corporate profit-taking, and the dominance of speculative capital over real production. But none of this will change as long as the people in power continue to apply temporary fixes to permanent problems. Long-term prosperity will only come if we face the hard truths and realign policy with the needs of everyday Americans, not just the boardrooms of corporate America. Until then, we better be prepared for a tough economic ride for the foreseeable future. So, my dear viewers, strap in, because this storm is far from over. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll continue breaking down the real story.